My mother is intensely pressuring me to accept her new boyfriend. The hardest part? She's completely aware of the terrible things he's done to me, yet she still expects me to simply be okay with him. It's an unbelievable and deeply painful demand that I cannot fathom agreeing to given everything. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about watching the man who was supposed to be my protector systematically dismantle my life, brick by agonizing brick, while my own mother stood by and let it happen. It's about fighting back when every ounce of hope was stripped away, and somehow finding the strength to reclaim myself from the wreckage. I was only 14 when my mom dropped the bomb. Peter was going to be my new father. Just 3 months earlier, my real dad had been ripped from our lives, accused of faking documents, a charge that felt like it materialized from thin air. The morning ice took him still burns in my mind like a brand. It was 7 a.m. on a Sunday. I was just eating my cereal when the door didn't just open, it exploded inward, splintering into a million pieces. ICE agents flooded our kitchen, slamming Dad to the floor. They zip-tied his wrists, pressing a knee into his temple. When he tried to look at me, they yanked his head back by his hair. "To me, huh?" he gasped, his voice choked, before they dragged him backward through our broken door. I ran after them barefoot, glass cutting my feet with every step. They threw him into the van like he was cargo, and him pressing his palm against the window was the last I saw of him. I ran home screaming at Mom that none of it made sense. Dad was a software engineer with a green card. This forgery accusation was a lie. That very afternoon, as I sat frozen on our couch with bandaged feet, Mom brought Peter through that same shattered doorway. "The immigration lawyer who'd fight for our family," she said. I watched numb as her hand found his far too easily. 5 months passed in a blur. Suddenly, we were living in Peter's glass tower, 20 floors above the city. Mom wore designer clothes and spoke about our blessed new beginning. An engagement ring appeared on her finger as if it had always belonged there. She even stopped speaking Spanish at home, claiming it was safer that way. Peter settled into his new role instantly. At breakfast, he'd watch me over his newspaper. "You're transforming into quite the American beauty, Sophia." He'd stretch the word American, and a chill would run down my spine. That week, he enrolled me in an all-white private school. I tried to tell Mom that Peter felt dangerous, but she just laughed, calling me a jealous child. "You just miss having all my attention," she said, painting her nails, something she never did for Dad. That Friday after school, Peter cornered me in the kitchen. I was doing homework when his shadow fell over my textbook. His fingers wrapped around my wrist like a shackle, pressing until my bones ached. "Careful about tattling to Mommy, Sophia. Your aunt's work permit expires soon." His phone appeared, ICE already typed in the contact list. "One button, Sophia." That's all it takes. My heart hammered against my ribs. That night, my hands shaking on the keyboard, I created a secret email account. It took me days, but I finally found my dad. I sent him a message, and he responded 3 days later with the biggest paragraph ever, promising they'd never truly take him away from me. I desperately wanted to believe it. But then, one morning, I got off the school bus, and the secretary handed me a new ID card. Sophia Castellanos had become Sophia Johnson. "Your mother filed the paperwork yesterday," she said, as if it was perfectly normal. I threw up in the bathroom, staring at that stranger's last name. 2 days later, Peter found me crying over Dad's old shirt that I'd hidden away. He settled beside me on the couch, too close. The cushions dipped toward him, his palm pressed against my knee, his thumb moving in slow, nauseating circles. "This is how American families show appreciation, Sophia. We take care of each other." His fingers started traveling upward. I bolted. I ran to the garage and hid behind Mom's car until dinner, breathing in motor oil and counting every agonizing minute. Dad's messages became my oxygen. He sent me a drawing of 2 bears hugging, something he used to do when I was little and scared. 6 weeks later, his final hearing came. Peter had dropped him as a client, so he was representing himself. I begged Mom, "Please, just let me speak for him. Let me testify that he's a good man." But she was putting on earrings, getting ready for dinner with Peter. Peter interrupted me from the doorway. "We have that family getaway, remember? 3 nights in Austin, but he's my father." I cried, Peter's jaw tightened. "And your father is an animal and a criminal." I started to shout back, "No, you're an animal." And Peter's palm cracked across my face. I hit the floor, tears streaming. Mom walked over, examining her manicure. "You need to learn respect." It was only in Austin that I found out Peter was staying in the room next to mine. He pushed through the connecting door at 2 a.m. His weight pinned me down. American girls stay quiet. I bit my tongue until it bled and counted the roses on the wallpaper, desperate to drown out the feeling. The drive back was 500 miles of suffocating silence. At home, Mom discovered my secret emails to Dad. She pretended to be me and sent him the nastiest message she could, telling him I never wanted to see him again, that he was dead to me. She even found the paper drawing of the two bears and fed it to the garbage disposal. But she wasn't done. That evening, Peter installed cameras in my room so I couldn't hide anything. He started reviewing the footage nightly from his phone, making sure I knew he was watching. Everything inside me shattered. I walked around like a broken marionette for 2 months. Dad was back in Peru. Peter did what he wanted in plain sight, knowing Mom never cared. I tried to buy locks to keep him out at night, but he always knew how to pick them. I remember being on the brink of ending my life when our old building's receptionist called my name. He had an envelope for me. I saw the sender had written a message, not to give this to Peter or Mom, only me. My heart exploded. It was Dad. I hid the envelope in my torn mattress and waited until I was alone to open it. My opportunity came 3 weeks later when Mom and Peter left for a day trip to Houston. I ripped open the envelope and immediately started crying. Dad knew that my last message was fake, that it wasn't me. He told me he loved me, and reading it made me feel more alive than I had in the whole year. But it was the ending that caught my eye. I hid a notebook in our old house's ventilation grate. If you find it, you can get me back. My heart stopped. I packed my bag and set out, taking 3 buses to our old building. I picked the lock and went inside. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stood there for a second, breathing in that familiar smell of our old life that still hung in the empty rooms. My legs carried me straight to Dad's bedroom, even though my heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The carpet still had those same stains from when I spilled grape juice 3 years ago. I pressed myself against the hallway wall to steady my shaking hands. The bedroom door was half open, and dust particles floated in the afternoon light coming through the window. I stepped inside and went straight to the corner where Dad said the vent would be. The metal grate was right there, painted white like the walls. But something was wrong. The screws looked different, newer and shinier than the old paint around them. My stomach dropped as I realized someone might have already been here. Peter knew about this place. He had keys from when he was handling Dad's case. My hands started shaking harder as I thought about him finding the notebook first. I ran to the kitchen and yanked open drawers until I found an old butter knife stuck in the back of one. The metal handle was cold in my sweaty palm. As I went back to the bedroom, I wedged the knife under the first screw and started turning, jumping every time the building creaked or someone walked past in the hallway outside. The screw was tight and my fingers kept slipping on the knife handle. After what felt like forever, it finally came loose and clinked on the floor. 3 more screws to go. Each one took longer than the last because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. A door slammed somewhere in the building and I froze, listening for footsteps coming closer. Nothing happened, so I kept working on the last screw. The grate finally came free, and I set it carefully on the floor, trying not to make noise. I reached into the dark space behind it, my fingers searching through dust and dead bugs. Please be there. Please be there. I kept thinking over and over. My fingertips touched something spiral and plastic, and I almost cried right there. I pulled out Dad's blue notebook, the one he always carried to work meetings. Seeing his handwriting on the cover made my eyes burn with tears I had to blink away. I sat on the floor and started flipping through pages covered in his neat writing. There were case numbers everywhere, dates going back 2 years, and notes about different clients with some names circled in red pen. Peter's name kept showing up next to words that made my blood run cold. I found a whole section from the month before the ice raid with Peter's name all over it. Dad had written fabricated evidence next to one date and document manipulation next to another. There were case numbers that matched other families Peter had worked with. This was exactly what I needed to prove Dad was set up by the same man who was supposed to help him. My hands steadied as I kept reading, finding more connections and patterns in Dad's careful notes. I looked at my phone and realized I'd been here almost an hour already. Peter tracked my location through my phone and would see I wasn't at the school or the library where I said I'd be. I had to move fast now. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera, then remembered the cloud account I'd made at the school, using the computer lab, so Peter couldn't trace it back to me. I logged in and started taking pictures of every single page, making sure each photo was clear enough to read Dad's writing. Page after page, I photographed everything, checking each image before moving to the next. The upload bar moved slowly with each photo going to the cloud. My hands weren't shaking anymore as I focused on this one thing that might help get Dad back. About halfway through the notebook, I found something that made me stop breathing for a second. It was a note about my aunt's work permit with dates from last year. Way before Peter ever threatened me in the kitchen, Dad had written Peter's name next to it with a question mark and the word leverage underlined 3 times. Peter had been planning to use my aunt against us from the very beginning, even while he was pretending to help Dad with his case. It hit me. Peter kept showing up at exactly the right moments to control everything. First, he appears as their lawyer right after Dad gets taken. Then he's somehow already engaged to Mom 5 months later. And now Dad's notebook reveals Peter was planning moves against our family way before anyone even knew who he was. I kept photographing, finding more evidence with every page. There were email addresses, phone numbers, and references to other documents Dad must have saved somewhere else. Each photo uploaded automatically to the cloud where Peter couldn't delete them, even if he took my phone. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and I froze with the phone still in my hand. They got closer and stopped right outside the apartment door. I held my breath and waited. The footsteps moved past, and I heard keys jingling as someone opened the apartment 2 doors down. The neighbor, the one who always complained about noise, was home. I went back to photographing but moved faster now. The last pages had notes about Peter's other clients. Families who got deported even though they had valid papers, just like Dad. Their case numbers were all there with dates and outcomes. Finally, I got to the last page and checked that all the photos had uploaded to the cloud. They were all there. Every single page of evidence safe where Peter couldn't reach it. I heard the neighbor's door open again and footsteps in the hallway. This time they stopped right at our old apartment door. I looked up and saw her standing there, looking at me through the doorway I'd left open. She squinted at me like she was trying to remember who I was. I stood up quickly and forced myself to smile even though my heart was racing. I told her I was just picking up some old mail for my mom, holding up the notebook like it was nothing important. She nodded slowly but kept staring at me with this suspicious look on her face. She asked if my mom knew I was here alone, and I said yes, she sent me to get the mail. The neighbor kept standing there for another few seconds before finally walking away, but I could feel her still watching from her doorway. I stuffed the notebook deep in my backpack and zipped it closed, then walked out of the apartment as calmly as I could manage. The neighbor was definitely still watching from her door as I went down the stairs. Outside, I started walking fast toward the bus stop, keeping the backpack pressed tight against my chest. 3 different buses to get back to Peter's place, and every minute on them felt like hours. I kept checking behind me to make sure no one was following. The notebook felt heavy in my bag, like it was burning through the fabric. An old man sat next to me on the second bus, and I pulled the bag tighter against me, terrified he might somehow know what was inside. Every stop took forever, and I counted them down in my head. Finally, the 3rd bus dropped me 2 blocks from Peter's building, and I walked the rest, trying to think of what to say when I got there. The glass doors opened, and I walked into the lobby trying to look normal, even though the notebook felt like it weighed 100 pounds in my backpack. The elevator ride up took forever, and I kept checking my phone to make sure the photos were still uploaded to the cloud. When I pushed open Peter's door, he was sitting on the leather couch with his laptop, and he looked up at me with this casual smile that made my skin crawl. "Where have you been all day?" I kept my face blank the way I'd learned to do and told him I was at the library studying for my history test. He nodded but kept watching me as I walked to my room, and I could feel his eyes following me the whole way. I locked my door and shoved the notebook deep under my mattress where the torn part was already hiding Dad's letter. The next morning at the school, I was walking to first period when Miss Bennett called my name from her office door. She asked me to come in for a minute and closed the door behind us, then pointed at my arm where my sleeve had ridden up. "Sophia, those bruises look painful." My stomach dropped, and I pulled my sleeve down fast, telling her I was just clumsy and fell off my bike last week. She gave me this look that said she didn't believe me at all, but she just nodded and said her door was always open if I needed to talk. During computer class that afternoon, I created a new email account using the school computer since I didn't trust my phone anymore. I typed out a message to Dad using the code phrase he taught me when I was little, something about bluebirds singing in the morning that meant everything was okay. But I needed help. I told him I found the notebook and asked what I should do with all the evidence inside it. 3 days of checking that email every chance I got, and finally, Dad wrote back with a long message that made my hands shake. He said to find Eduardo Santoro at a legal aid office downtown and gave me the exact address on Maple Street. He said Eduardo helped families like ours before, and I should tell him that the sparrows were flying south, which would let Eduardo know Dad sent me. The next week, I told Mom I had tutoring after school for algebra, but instead I walked to the bus stop and took the number 47 downtown. My stomach felt sick the whole ride, and I kept looking behind me to make sure nobody from Peter's office was following. The legal aid office was in this old building that smelled like coffee and paper, and the receptionist pointed me to a door at the end of the hall. Eduardo was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with these kind eyes that reminded me of how Dad used to look at me before everything went bad. I sat in the plastic chair across from his messy desk and started telling him everything, about the notebook, Peter's threats, and what happened in Austin. Though I could barely get those words out, he listened without interrupting once, just taking notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, he leaned forward and said we needed to be really careful because Peter had connections everywhere, but there were ways to build a case. He pulled out his phone and showed me how to make recordings that would automatically upload to a cloud server with timestamps that courts would accept as evidence. He wrote down a list of warning signs to watch for, like Peter destroying documents or moving money around, and gave me an emergency number that would text him my location if I ever felt unsafe. 2 days later, I was sitting in English class when I noticed my phone doing weird stuff, apps opening by themselves and the battery going from full to almost dead in an hour. I realized Peter must have installed something to track me when I wasn't looking. So, I left that phone in my locker and used the birthday money I'd been hiding to buy a cheap prepaid at the gas station near school. That weekend, my aunt came over for dinner, and I waited until she went to the bathroom to sneak into the dining room where her purse was. My hands were shaking as I pulled out her work permit and took photos with my burner phone. And the dates matched exactly what Dad had written about Peter using her status to threaten me. I felt sick knowing she'd been turned into a weapon against me without even knowing it. Monday morning, I went to the school office before first period and asked the secretary why my last name had been changed on all my records without anybody asking me. She looked really uncomfortable and shuffled through some papers before saying my mom had filed the paperwork, but I could tell from her face that she thought something wasn't right about the whole thing. That night at dinner, Peter was talking about my aunt again while cutting his steak, saying how work permits were so fragile these days and one wrong move could change everything. Mom was staring at her plate and pretending she couldn't hear him, but I saw her hand shaking when she reached for her water glass. I had my burner phone in my pocket, recording everything. And when Peter said her permit could disappear with one phone call, I felt my chest get tight, but kept my face blank. The next morning, I went to Eduardo's office and he introduced me to this lawyer who worked for free on cases like mine. She was younger than I expected, with short black hair and glasses that kept sliding down her nose, and she looked at all my evidence spread across the conference table. She said we needed more witnesses and more recordings, but what I had was a good start, and she'd file some paperwork to get things moving. 3 days later, I was sitting in Miss Bennett's office and my hands wouldn't stop shaking when I told her Peter threatened to get my aunt deported if I said anything. Her face got really serious, and she put down her pen and said she was required by law to report this, and I felt scared, but also like maybe someone would finally help. 2 days after that, I was in math class when the principal's assistant came to get me, and Detective Harrington was waiting in the conference room with a notebook and recorder. He was older, with gray hair and kind eyes, and he asked me to tell him everything about the threats. But when he asked if there was anything else, I couldn't get the words out about Austin. That afternoon, Peter showed up at the school saying there was a misunderstanding with the counselor and signed me out early. The whole drive home, he didn't say anything, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. The next day, I went to the building during lunch and found the receptionist who'd given me Dad's letter and handed him a flash drive with all the notebook photos. He put it in his desk drawer and promised he'd only give it back to me or Eduardo if something happened to me. That weekend, Peter had his lawyer friends over for dinner, and I had to serve drinks while they sat around talking about cases. One of them was laughing about Peter's magic touch with immigration judges and how he could make problems disappear, and I had my burner phone recording in my apron pocket the whole time. Late one night, while Peter and Mom were watching TV downstairs, I snuck into his home office and started timing everything. He always left his laptop open on the desk and took exactly 12 minutes in the shower every morning. I figured that might be enough time to copy files. 3 nights later, I heard the shower start upstairs and counted to 30 before slipping into his office with a flash drive. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely plug it into the USB port, and the files were copying so slow I wanted to scream. The progress bar was at 60% when the water stopped, and I heard his footsteps on the bathroom floor. 70%, and he was walking down the hall, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. 80%, and his footsteps were getting closer, and I was trying not to panic. 90%, and I heard him stop at the bedroom door, probably looking for his phone. The files finished copying, and I yanked out the drive and dove behind the door just as he walked past toward the bedroom. I held my breath and waited until he was inside, then slipped out and ran downstairs as quiet as I could. My legs were shaking so bad I had to sit on the couch for 5 minutes before they'd work right again. The next morning, I took the flash drive to Eduardo's office and watched him plug it into his computer while my stomach twisted into knots. His eyes got wider as he clicked through the files, and then he pulled up 2 documents side by side on his screen. He pointed at the timestamps and showed me how they'd been changed after Dad's arrest date, and the metadata showed Peter's computer as the last one to edit them. Eduardo said this was huge evidence, but we needed someone who could verify the files hadn't been tampered with, so he made copies and called a computer expert he knew. 3 days later, Mom cornered me in the kitchen while I was making a sandwich. Her face was all red, and she kept waving her hands around saying I was making trouble for our family and destroying everything she'd worked for. She said my aunt couldn't visit anymore because I was filling her head with lies about Peter. I looked at her standing there in her new designer dress with diamond earrings Dad could never afford, and realized she was picking Peter's money over her own sister. The next day at the school, Miss Bennett pulled me into her office and sat down real close to me. She said she was requesting another welfare check and wanted to help me make a safety plan with code words I could text if I was in danger. We spent an hour going through different situations, and she helped me pack an emergency bag with clothes and cash and important papers. She stayed with me the whole time and kept saying I was being so brave, even though I didn't feel brave at all. Detective Harrington called me that afternoon, and I met him at the police station after school. He said they were looking into everything, but these cases take time, and maybe they could get subpoenas for Peter's work emails in a few weeks. I wanted to scream that I didn't have weeks, but I just nodded and thanked him for trying. On the bus ride home, my phone buzzed with a text from my aunt saying her permit renewal got delayed and she might need to leave the state for a job in Texas. My chest got tight because I knew this was Peter's doing, and the guilt of dragging her into my mess made me want to give up on everything. That night, while Peter and Mom were watching TV, I snuck into the garage with my emergency bag and hid it behind old Christmas decoration boxes. I added water bottles and granola bars I'd been stealing from the pantry, plus copies of all my evidence in a sealed envelope with Eduardo's name written on the front. The next morning, Mom came into my room holding a stack of papers and sat on my bed with this fake smile. She said Peter had filed adoption papers to make everything official and safer for our immigration status. The papers had my name crossed out and Sophia Johnson written in its place. I wanted to rip them into pieces, but I just nodded and waited until she left to take photos of every single page with my burner phone. Eduardo called me 2 days later and said he'd filed a complaint with the state bar about Peter's handling of Dad's case, using all the evidence we'd gathered. He warned me Peter would find out eventually, but at least now there was an official record of what he'd done. A week passed before Detective Harrington called again and said he'd arrange for me to do a forensic interview at a special center for kids. The building had bright painted walls with butterflies, and the interviewer was this calm woman who spoke real soft. She explained we'd go at my pace and I could take breaks whenever I needed. I started telling her about Austin, and my throat kept closing up, so I had to stop and drink water. She never rushed me or looked impatient, just sat there with her notebook and waited. When I got to the part about the hotel room, my hands started shaking and I had to stop 3 times. I told her about Peter coming through the connecting door at 2 a.m. and how heavy he was on top of me. I explained how Mom blamed me after and said I needed to learn respect. I described the cameras in my room and how I knew Peter watched me changing clothes from his phone. The interviewer wrote everything down real careful, and when I finished, she said I was very brave for telling her. She asked if I wanted to add anything else, and I told her about Peter grabbing my wrist in the kitchen and threatening my aunt. I showed her the fading bruises that were still yellow on my arm. She took photos with a special camera and measured them with a ruler. When we were done, she gave me a stuffed bear to take home and said someone would be in touch soon. The drive back to Peter's building felt longer than usual, and I held that bear tight against my chest. Mom was waiting in the living room when I got home, and she looked mad. She asked where I'd been all afternoon, and I lied about staying late at the library. Peter came out of his office and stared at me for a long time without saying anything. That night, I heard them arguing through the wall but couldn't make out the words. The next morning, Peter left early for work, and Mom wouldn't look at me during breakfast. I knew something was changing, but I didn't know if it was good or bad yet. Detective Harrington called me 2 days later and asked me to come to the station after school. I took the bus there and found him waiting in the same interview room where we'd talked before. He had a folder open on the table with my statement typed up, and he pushed it across for me to read. Everything I told the forensic interviewer was there in black and white, and seeing it written down made my stomach hurt. He waited until I finished reading, then leaned back in his chair and explained that even with my statement, they needed physical evidence or witnesses to bring criminal charges against Peter. My chest felt like it was caving in when he said that. He must have seen my face because he quickly added that the investigation was still going, and these things build real slow, but they were taking it seriously. I left the station feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. That same afternoon, Eduardo called and said he'd been talking with Miss Chen about filing for an emergency protective order. They could use my recorded threats from Peter and the forensic interview as evidence. He said the judge would probably schedule a hearing in about 2 weeks, and I'd have to testify, but Miss Chen would prepare me for it. I agreed, even though the thought of standing in court made me want to throw up. 3 days later, Ms. Chen sent me copies of all the paperwork they'd filed, and I sat in my room reading through it while Peter was at work. Everything was laid out so clear, with dates and times and transcripts of my recordings. 4 days after that, Eduardo forwarded me something that made me drop my phone. Mom had submitted her own statement to the court, and she was calling me disturbed and attention-seeking since Dad left. She wrote that I'd been making up stories for attention and acting out because I couldn't accept Peter as my new father. Reading her words felt worse than being hit because at least bruises heal, but this was my own mother throwing me under the bus. Miss Chen called right after I read it and said this actually helped our case because it showed the hostile environment I was living in. She said judges see through this stuff all the time. That night at dinner, I set my burner phone to record in my pocket and started asking Mom about the cameras in my room. She was cutting her chicken and didn't even look up when she said she knew about them. I asked why she thought it was okay for Peter to watch me changing clothes. Her hand stopped moving and she said it was for my safety, but her voice cracked on the word safety, and I could tell she didn't believe it herself. I kept pushing, and she finally admitted Peter reviewed the footage every night on his phone. She said it like it was normal, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. I got the whole thing recorded and sent it to Eduardo that night. The next morning, I stood in my room looking at the camera mounted in the corner near my closet. I'd been changing in the bathroom for months, but sometimes I forgot, and Peter would make comments that let me know he'd seen. I started moving my desk lamp around and realized if I angled it just right and draped my sweater over the shade, it created a shadow that blocked part of the camera's view. It was a tiny space, maybe 3 feet wide, but it was mine. I could change clothes there without being watched. It wasn't much, but having that small bit of privacy back made me feel a little more human. 2 days later, I was going through Dad's notebook again, looking for anything we might have missed. I was reading the margins when I noticed these tiny letters that didn't make sense at first. Then I realized they were initials scattered through different pages, always near entries about Peter's cases. The initials were KM, and they appeared next to notes about document changes and client meetings. I remembered Peter had a paralegal who quit real sudden last year, and her name was Karen something. The timeline matched up perfect with when these notes stopped appearing. I called Eduardo right away and told him what I found. He got real quiet, then said contacting her directly would be too dangerous because Peter might find out. Instead, he suggested we file a Freedom of Information Act request for the ICE tip records from when Dad got reported. He said the government has to release certain information if you request it the right way. He helped me fill out all the forms over the phone, warning me it could take months to get anything back. We sent it off the next day with certified mail so we'd have proof they received it. The waiting was the worst part. Every day I checked the mail hoping for something, but weeks went by with nothing. Peter kept acting normal at home, like he hadn't destroyed my whole life. Mom pretended everything was fine even though she'd jump whenever he raised his voice. Then, 6 weeks later, I got home from school and found a thick envelope from the Department of Homeland Security. My hands shook as I opened it. Most of it was blacked out, but there on page 3 was the information about the anonymous tip that started Dad's case. The IP address was listed, and when Eduardo ran it through a search, it came back registered to Peter's law firm. We had proof that the tip came from Peter's office. Eduardo made certified copies of everything and added it to our evidence file. He said this was huge, but we needed to be careful about how we used it. 3 nights later, I was doing homework at the kitchen table when Peter came up behind me. I tried to get up, but he grabbed my wrist and twisted hard. The pain shot up my arm, and I gasped. He leaned close and whispered that he knew I'd been causing trouble and it needed to stop. His grip got tighter, and I remembered the panic button Eduardo had helped me set up on my phone. I managed to reach into my pocket with my free hand and triple-tapped the power button, which sent my location to Detective Harrington with the word help. Peter kept twisting my wrist, talking about how ungrateful I was when we heard sirens getting closer. He let go immediately and stepped back, smoothing his shirt. 20 minutes after I'd sent the text, 2 police officers knocked on our door, saying they'd received a welfare check request. Peter switched into his charming lawyer mode, instantly explaining there must be some mistake and everything was fine here. The officers looked at me and asked if I was okay. I wanted to scream that nothing was okay, but I just nodded because I knew they couldn't do anything without seeing immediate danger. They gave me their card before leaving and told me to call if I needed anything. Peter watched from the window until their car disappeared, then turned to look at me, but didn't say anything. He just walked to his office and slammed the door. The next 2 weeks crawled by with Peter watching me like a hawk, but keeping his distance. Finally, the day of the protective order hearing arrived. I sat in the courtroom with Miss Chen while Eduardo organized our evidence folders, my hands sweating as I watched Peter and his lawyer across the aisle. The judge called the case, and Miss Chen stood up, handing over the stack of audio recordings I'd made, with timestamps showing exactly when Peter threatened my aunt's work permit. She played one recording right there in court where you could hear Peter saying he'd make one phone call to ICE if I didn't stay quiet. Peter's lawyer jumped up, saying I was just a troubled teen acting out after my dad left, that I was making things up for attention. But the judge kept looking at the FOIA documents showing the tip about Dad came from Peter's office IP address. I had to testify about the threats and the cameras in my room, keeping my voice steady, even when Peter's lawyer asked if maybe I just misunderstood things. The judge asked to hear another recording, and this time it was Peter talking about how my aunt's permit could disappear. His voice clear as day on the tape. After 3 hours of testimony and evidence, the judge looked at Peter and said she'd heard enough. She granted a temporary protective order right there, ordering Peter to stay 500 feet away from me, and demanding the cameras be removed from my room immediately. For the first time in months, someone in authority actually believed me, and I watched Peter's face turn red as the judge kept talking about the evidence being concerning. That same afternoon, a social worker showed up at Peter's apartment saying child services needed to interview everyone. Mom tried to act like everything was fine, but the social worker said they'd already reviewed the court records, and I'd be staying with my aunt during the investigation. I packed my real bags while Mom stood in the doorway, not looking at me, just staring at her phone like I wasn't even there. The social worker helped me carry my stuff to her car, and I didn't look back at that glass tower, just kept my eyes forward as we drove to my aunt's apartment on the other side of town. 3 days later, Eduardo called to say Peter's law firm sent a threatening letter about defamation and false allegations that could ruin his career. Miss Chen laughed when she read it and said this was typical intimidation tactics, then filed it as evidence of continued harassment since he wasn't supposed to contact me, even through lawyers. The next week brought the biggest news yet when Eduardo called to say the state bar opened a formal investigation into Peter's conduct. They'd reviewed our evidence and suspended his license pending the investigation, which Eduardo said was huge because it meant they found enough to take it seriously. Peter couldn't practice law anymore, at least not until the investigation finished. And that meant he couldn't use his connections to hurt other families like mine. Dad's new lawyer, someone Eduardo found who actually wanted to help, filed a motion to reopen Dad's case based on the FOIA evidence and Peter's suspension. There was no guarantee the court would agree, but for the first time since Dad got taken, we had real hope he might come home. The lawyer said the evidence of Peter fabricating the tip was strong, and, combined with the bar suspension, judges would have to take it seriously. That's when Mom started texting me privately, saying she was scared to leave because Peter controlled all the money and knew immigration law better than anyone. She said she didn't know what to do, that she was trapped, and I felt a tiny bit of pity mixed with all my anger. But I didn't respond because Eduardo and Miss Chen said I needed boundaries, that Mom made her choices and I couldn't save her from them. Detective Harrington called the next morning saying he got a warrant for Peter's work computer and phone records. He said these digital trails often revealed patterns that suspects thought they'd hidden, and his tech team was already going through everything. Meanwhile, I went to the school office and started filling out paperwork to legally change my name back to Sofia Castellanos. The same secretary who'd given me that awful Sophia Johnson ID card smiled and said she'd push it through as fast as possible, that she was glad I was taking my name back. My aunt had been stressed about her work permit expiring, but Eduardo connected her with a different immigration lawyer, who actually helped people instead of destroying them. The lawyer filed for a 6-month extension, and it got approved within 2 weeks, giving us breathing room while everything else got sorted out. Living at my aunt's felt strange at first, but at least I could lock my bedroom door and know nobody was watching me through cameras. 3 weeks passed before the full protective order hearing, and I spent every night going over my testimony with Eduardo. The courthouse felt huge that morning, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking as we walked through the metal detectors. Peter sat at a table across the room with his lawyer, not even looking at me, just checking his phone like this was nothing. His lawyer stood up first and started asking me about every single detail from my statement. He wanted exact dates and times for everything, trying to make it seem like I couldn't remember things. Eduardo had warned me this would happen, so I kept my answers short and stuck to what I knew for sure. The lawyer asked why I didn't report things sooner, and I explained about the cameras and the threats to my aunt. He tried to make it sound like I was making things up because I was mad about my parents' divorce. I wanted to scream, but I kept my voice steady and just repeated what happened in Austin. The judge listened to everything and took notes on her computer the whole time. She asked Peter's lawyer if his client wanted to testify, and he said no. After 2 hours of questions, the judge said she'd made her decision. She granted the 1-year protective order and said Peter had to stay 500 feet away from me, my school, and my aunt's house. Any contact with Mom had to be supervised by child services. Peter's face turned red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm before he could say anything. Walking out of that courthouse felt like the first real win I'd had in months. A week later, 2 people from the state bar came to Eduardo's office to interview me about Peter's immigration cases. They had folders full of papers and asked about everything I'd found in Dad's notebook. I showed them the patterns I'd noticed, how Peter would take money from families and then mess up their cases on purpose. They wrote down everything and asked if I had any other evidence. I gave them copies of all the recordings and the FOIA documents about Dad's case. They said my testimony was really important for their investigation. That same afternoon, Eduardo got a call that made him smile for the first time since I'd met him. Dad's motion for case review had been accepted by the immigration court. The hearing wouldn't be for 4 months, but at least they were looking at his case again. Eduardo said the judge saw the evidence about Peter fabricating the tip and wanted to review everything. I started crying right there in his office because 4 months felt like forever, but also like hope. The next week, my aunt took me to a community clinic to meet Dr. Xiao for my first therapy appointment. The waiting room had old magazines and plastic chairs, but Dr. Xiao's office felt safe, with plants everywhere and soft lighting. She didn't push me to talk about Austin or anything I wasn't ready for. We just talked about sleeping better and dealing with nightmares. She taught me breathing exercises and gave me a journal to write down my feelings when they got too big. I went every Tuesday after school and slowly started feeling less jumpy all the time. Living at my aunt's apartment was so different from Peter's glass tower. We spoke Spanish at dinner and watched telenovelas on her old TV that only got 3 channels. I'd sit at her kitchen table with Dad's notebook and add my own notes about everything that happened. Writing it all down made it feel more real, like evidence that I survived. My aunt would make me hot chocolate, and we'd talk about Dad and the old days before everything went bad. She hung up pictures of our family on the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit. Her apartment was small, but it was ours, and nobody was watching us through cameras. Detective Harrington called one afternoon to update me on the criminal case against Peter. He said Peter was still suspended from practicing law, but they hadn't filed criminal charges yet. The prosecutor wanted to build the strongest case possible so it would stick. He said these things take time, but they were still investigating and gathering evidence. I wanted Peter in jail, but I understood they had to do it right. Meanwhile, Mom had started court-ordered counseling as part of the custody stuff. Her therapist sent me a letter from Mom saying she was sorry and needed time to figure things out. The letter was only 1 page and didn't say much except that she was working on herself. I wasn't ready to forgive her for choosing Peter and money over keeping me safe, But I folded the letter and put it in Dad's notebook anyway, because maybe someday I'd want to read it again. Eduardo called me back to his office to sign an affidavit for the bar investigation. He went through every word with me to make sure it was exactly right. The affidavit talked about what Peter did to Dad's case and how he threatened other families too. Eduardo said my testimony could stop Peter from hurting more people like us. Signing my name at the bottom felt important, like I was finally fighting back the right way. The best part of every week was video calling Dad on my aunt's laptop. His face would fill the screen, and even though the connection was bad sometimes, seeing him made everything feel less awful. He'd tell me about his job at a computer repair shop and how he was saving money for when he could come back. His lawyer was optimistic about the case review and said the evidence about Peter was really strong. Dad would show me drawings he made and tell me stories to make me laugh. It wasn't the same as hugging him, but hearing his voice saying he loved me was enough to keep going. 3 weeks after that call, I walked into the school office during lunch, and the secretary smiled when she saw me. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a new plastic ID card with my photo from last month. Sofia Castellanos was printed across the bottom in bold letters. Not Johnson anymore. My hands shook a little when I took it from her. She told me all my records were updated in the system, and my transcripts would show my real name now. I thanked her and went to the bathroom to look at the card again by myself. Seeing my dad's last name next to my picture made my chest feel lighter. The legal name change paperwork was still moving through the courts, but at least at the school, I was me again. That afternoon, I sat at my aunt's kitchen table with Dad's old notebook open in front of me. I started writing on a blank page near the back, my pen moving across the lines. I wrote about the new locks on the apartment door that only my aunt and I had keys for. I wrote about not having cameras watching me change clothes anymore. I wrote about the cases against Peter moving forward, but not being the only thing I thought about. I wrote about sleeping through the night sometimes now without waking up scared. My breathing came easier these days, even though I wasn't completely okay yet. But sitting there in my aunt's kitchen with afternoon sun coming through the window, easier breathing felt like enough for today.